Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us in another of our Talk With series. And it's really my pleasure to be able to have a talk with Dean Radin. And today he's going to be talking on mind influence experiment. Meditators show stronger influences. Now, Dean has done talk with us before and has been at our conferences and done talks. But I wanted specifically just to mention this one, the effects of distant intention on water crystal formation, because his work always gets down right at the fundamental level, kind of between the physical world and the non-physical world. And that's one of the things he's going to be talking about here in terms of mind influence. So his short bio, he's chief scientist at IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, he held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He is author or co-author of over 250 technical and popular articles, 36 book chapters, and now four books, including the award-winning The Conscious Universe, Entangled Mind, the award winner Supernormal, and in April, Real Magic will be coming out. And in fact, at our App 2018, he will be talking about that. So with that, let me turn this over to you. So I think what I have to do is stop sharing.
Right. Okay. So
and
now,
now you can you make you can do it yourself?
let's see. Do I have an option? How do I share something?
I may wait. I may have to make you a co-host. So again, I'm new at this, so I wish I would do it a little faster.
Oh, I see. I see a button that says share screen.
Oh, you can do it. That's the one.
Oh, okay. So let's try this.
Yeah.
Do you see this?
Yep.
See if I present.
Noetic Science. Beautiful.
All right. So let's play that.
There you go.
I think I'll make it full screen. So that's as full a screen as I'm going to get on it.
And that's
so
good.
This was a talk I gave actually a couple of days ago for the IONS board and what's called our circle members. These are high-end donors to IONS. So this is a portion of that presentation.
Okay, super.
So I use it as a way of advertising my interest and book on magic. And of course, I'm not talking about levitation or self-decapitation type of magic. I'm also not talking about the way that magic is portrayed in the entertainment business. In entertainment, by the way, magic is regarded as one of the reliable tropes to produce a billion-dollar movie. And it has always been that way, both in television and fiction and movies. I'm also not talking about traditional ideas of magic, most of which range between fantasy and unicorns and fairies, or demons and witches and things of that sort. It does come out of that tradition, but that's not what I'm talking about. But why then would a scientist write a book about magic? Well, first of all, I work at a serious institute as a place for magical thinking, so that's not what it's about either. So in speaking to my academic friends, I wanted to make it clear that this book does actually not fit within the metaphysical genre of books, but they don't know where else to put it. So in order to make it clear that this is actually a book about science, I asked my friends who are in the academic world to say a few nice words about it. So here's one of the endorsements. I'll mention more about them later, about these endorsements. So two Nobel laureates have endorsed it. One is a physicist, the other is a chemist. The president of the American Statistical Association, which you probably know of as Jessica Utts, a program director at the National Science Foundation, a winner of an astrophysics medal from the National Academy of Sciences, and professors of physics, psychology, neuroscience, and psychiatry. So altogether, maybe 20 people who I've asked to give an endorsement. And that then discriminates this book from the usual sort of thing that you would find if you were looking for books on magic. I trust him. He has a science background. So essentially what I'm talking about is a higher understanding of nature. I might put it in slightly in different terms, like a deeper understanding of nature pulls you into the domain of magic. And the magic we're talking about are the practices that you can find that go all the way back to shamanism. They include divination, which includes remote viewing, includes precognition. Force of will, which is mentally influencing the world through your intention. And theurgy, which is traditionally the idea that you can communicate or cooperate with spirits or disembodied entities. So that's basically what you find in every tradition that has to do with magic. They're all about what in the modern terms we would call telepathy, precognition, clairvoyance, psychokinetics, and aspects of survival research. So a couple of days ago, I was interviewed by CBS News for a morning show, and the correspondent asked, well, what is ESP? So I told her what ESP is. And then she said, well, but Sean Carroll, who's a physicist at Caltech, says that ESP is impossible. So what do you say to that? Well, you know, when you're hit by that kind of a statement by a journalist, it's not entirely clear how to respond. But basically, my feeling was this. It's 20-year-olds loudly knowing things. In other words, there's a certain arrogance of youth where people are completely sure that something is the way that it is without actually knowing what they're talking about. And that's what I would say about Sean Carroll. So what I did respond was, well, independently of what people think is theoretically possible, the experimental evidence is very clear that these phenomena exist. And then she said, well, how does it work? How do these phenomena work? Well, I knew what you do in the news industry is give a soundbite. So this actually came out this past Sunday on the news, and I was interviewed for 2 hours, and I was probably on screen for 15 seconds. And of course, they have a narrative that they're putting together, and they pull quotes out to fit the narrative. So, you know, I knew I couldn't describe how it works. So this is what I would have said if I had the time. Well, first of all, if I have to explain the meaning of existence, then it isn't funny. So we'll go past that. So I would have said something like this. So first of all, when you think about an explanation, most people today think in terms of materialism, which is the scientific worldview. And it's like determination and hard work, just like Colin Powell is saying here. A dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work. So that's our idea of materialism is hard, sober, serious stuff involving matter and energy. On the other side of the philosophical spectrum, though, is idealism. And unfortunately, this has a connotation of unicorns and fairy forests and that sort of thing, and is seen as being so soft that it is irrelevant to the understanding of science. And what I'm going to argue is that is completely backwards. That a better view of what's going on in terms of reality is idealism, not materialism. So Sean Carroll is like a representative of scientific materialism. Matter is the basis of everything, including consciousness. And by matter, I mean matter and energy. Our ideas about what matter is has changed over time, but currently it's thought of as matter, energy is the same thing. But that is the basis of everything. By contrast, idealism is the complete opposite. Mind is the basis of everything, including matter. So I put here the philosopher George Berkeley, I think it's pronounced, even though it looks like Berkeley. So Berkeley said that as an idealist, that you can easily drop into solipsism, where the only thing that exists is your own mind. And so that's why with this little doll here, it says eye closing action and close his eyes and his enemies disappear. because if you're the only thing that exists and you close your eyes, nothing else exists. So that's a little joke. So from a materialism perspective, as material is imagined to be today, that psi phenomena of any type are considered to be either anomalous or prohibited completely. It's not possible. Whereas from an idealism perspective, psi phenomena are both natural and completely obvious. So this is one of the reasons why, for example, in the Stargate program, that psi were called anomalous cognition, because that's the only way that you can think about psi if you want to put on a hat as today's scientist and use the ideas that other people have in mind. After thinking about this long and hard for a while, I've come to the conclusion that that's actually not going to work. That's why I'm beginning to look at idealism as a more useful philosophical position to take. So if you're a materialist, a scientist who, just like me, brought up through this system, somewhere between anomalous and prohibited. If you're on the prohibited side, you end up being a skeptic like the amazing Randy. And from that perspective, any evidence presented can only be thought of as flaws or fraud. That's all that's left. On the anomalous side, where here you have parapsychology. Parapsychology is using standard scientific concepts and methods, but the concepts that we have to work with are things like forces and fields, maybe something about quantum mechanics, but then you end up with basically a miracle occurs. The psi part becomes a miracle because you can't fit it in very well, with the possible exception of maybe something about quantum mechanics. And on the idealism side, on the obvious side, you do end up with solipsism, nonsense. It's all in your mind. So that's not a very useful way of thinking about idealism, because you can't do anything with that. So on the other side is kind of where I'm headed, and I'm calling it psychophysical naturalism because I don't know what else to call it. The idea is that we need radical new concepts and methods, and that is essentially what we're trying to do at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We're all traditionally trained scientists. We cover domains of physics and neuroscience and computer science and biology and so on. But we also have the sense that there's a lot more to reality than just what we can get from today's materialism. So we're looking at new ways of understanding what's going on. And this is one of them. Who's the fairest one of all? And state your sources. So it's a little bit like that. So here's an example of a new method. This is a study involving a double slit system that we actually conducted in 2012 to 2013. It took a year to collect all of the data. But up until now, I haven't been allowed to talk about it because the sponsor of the study wanted to take all of the data and reanalyze it. So they spent 5 years reanalyzing all the data. So the basic of this kind of experiment with the double slit system is that it's very easy to show in a laboratory that if you take a double slit optical system and you don't know which of the two slits that the photons go through, then you get this interference pattern on the screen. Well, the interference pattern looks like the photons are behaving like waves, because that's exactly what you'd expect if you have waves going through two little slits. So there's nothing surprising about that. What is surprising is that if you do know which of the two slits that the photons go through, you get an extremely different pattern. You get a pattern that looks like the photons are behaving like little dots or little BBs. So this is a puzzle. How do we get from there to there is not well understood in physics at all. There are lots of speculations about how it might work. And in a sense, I didn't really care. What I cared about was, what is the difference between the eye open and the eye closed? And we're not talking here about physical eye. We're talking about the mental eye. It's the eye, it's the same eye you use when you do remote viewing. So you don't get to see anything. You have to imagine in your mind's eye that you could see which of the two slits the photon is going through. So that's the nature of the experiment. And in a sense, it becomes an experiment in clairvoyance, if you want to think of it that way, or as an experiment in a psychokinetic effect, because you could either know which of the two slits the photon goes through, or you could try to shove it to go through one or the other slit. So it could be either. And I think at that level, at this quantum level, I think the phenomena are basically the same. So this is what the apparatus looks like. It's pretty simple. You have a laser, you cut down the illumination level with a filter, it goes through a double slit, and then you have a camera that measures the illumination level. So we tend to use meditators or people who have some kind of attention training in these experiments, because it's partially because through meditation we have other reasons to suspect that people reach a deeper layer of mind or consciousness where these phenomena tend to be stronger. But there's a more pragmatic reason, and that is that if you ask somebody to do a mental task, to put their attention in a box in the next room, they can do that because they know how to use their attention. If you ask somebody who doesn't have attention training, especially people who are distracted by television and cell phones and everything else, they can do the task for roughly 5 seconds, and then they start thinking about everything else. Their mind begins to wander, and we can see that. We've done experiments where people have an EEG running, and we can tell that after you give an instruction that their attention remains for about 5 seconds, and then it falls apart. People just start thinking about cheeseburgers. So for pragmatic reasons, meditators are good. Meditators in general tend to be more open to these phenomena as well. And we've done surveys and we found that it's because meditators have these experiences, we're talking about psychic experiences or even mystical experiences as a result of their practice. So since they're more open to it, they're easier to get into the laboratory, and they seem to enjoy these kinds of tasks more than somebody who has no interest in meditation. So that's the task. You tell somebody, think about this, and now stop thinking about it. And now think about it and stop thinking about it. And the prediction is that what the line camera sees, the illumination level will change a little bit from a pattern where you don't know what's going on to a pattern where you do know what's going on. It's not going to collapse completely into a particle-like pattern, because the mind doesn't act the same way as putting your thumb over one of the slits. But we can predict that there will be a change in that interference pattern. So there's a new study, actually an old study now, but now I can talk about this. We recruited 25 participants. Each person did the test 10 times. Each test takes about a half an hour. And so here are the 3 of the 25 people. So it's a total of 250 sessions. This is roughly 5 times bigger than any previous experiment that we had done. Before and after each one of those sessions, we ran what we call a sham session. A sham participant was a light bulb, which was put in the same location where the person was sitting. And that's because we wanted the heat level to be about the same in the room. The interferometers that we're using are extremely sensitive to basically everything, including temperature change. So we would run a sham session with a light bulb, and then a person would do it, and then the person would do the second session, and then we do another session with a light bulb. We did this so that the controls were in close time proximity to when the person was doing it. So the temperature would be the same, the environment was the same, everything was the same as we could get it. So I'm skipping over that experiment now because it's not published yet, and there's a whole bunch of new elements in it that are, I think, very exciting and interesting. I'm going to go to one thing here which is probably of more interest to this group, and that is where I've been interested for many years in using remote viewing to look into the future when these kinds of phenomena form the basis of a technology, rather than simply laboratory curiosity. But where can you see in the future? And this was done in 1994. This was already 24 years ago. And at the time, that my request was 20 years from now, when we know a lot more about how this psychokinetic stuff works, what will be the methods that people are using? So I went to the best remote viewer I could find, which is Joe McMoneagle, and we hired him to do a series of 15 remote viewings on this topic. And so here's one. You can see that the name of this project we'll call the Psi Switch. We're trying to see a future technology. And the important part is this. So he drew at that time what you could easily see as a double slit system. That's what he drew. This was many years before anybody thought of using a double slit system as a target for this kind of experiment. And there's a couple of interesting things he says in here. One is that it involves a beam of very intense light. It sounds a lot like a laser to me. And it involves shielding with 2 slots in it. Well, that's a double slit system. Part of the rest of what he was saying here is of interest in this box in particular. And there's a close-up. The burst of decays is affecting it in number. And what he meant by decays is that there's some kind of particle or light or something that is going through the 2 slits. So that's what he's calling a decay. It's like a decay of a radioactive particle. But that the burst rate is affected in number, meaning that there's a greater variance that is going through one slit versus the other. So that gave me an idea. First of all, when you're working with a double slit system, you can work with exactly what the camera sees. It sees a certain pattern, but it's much more convenient to work with a Fourier transform of it. The Fourier transform of an image will tell you what kind of frequencies there are in the image. And so in a double slit system, you have 2 peaks. You have a peak on the left, which is the diffraction patterns, the shape, the overall shape of the interference pattern. And you also have a peak on the right side. In this image, it's at 45. That peak is that and the interference pattern has a fast-moving signal to it. That's the interference. And so we're interested in what's happening at 45 because that tells us how much interference there is. And the whole point of this test was that if your mind can change the interference pattern, well, then the spectral power at wave number 45 should be able to go up and down. And that becomes a sensitive way of looking at what's going on in the system. So what you're looking at here is the mean difference in the power spectrum for 250 experimental sessions and 250 sham sessions. And as you see, you can't see any difference because they overlap each other completely. So the spectrum looks the same in both the experimental and the sham conditions. So you don't see anything interesting there. But if you look at the variance, which is how I was interpreting what Joe was saying about a bursting difference, you do see a change in the variance. Like on around wave number 42, you see that the experimental result was much higher than the sham result. And every time you see that the white and black dots don't overlap, that's a difference in variance. Well, there's a lot of data that goes into this. So you can create a statistical test to see are these meaningful differences or not. And so this last plot is the odds to the 10th power. So as you see around wave number, what is it, maybe 36 or 37, this is 10 to the 10th to 1. That's the odds against chance that this is a null effect. So in other words, that is a real effect. In each one of those 5 dots that are up on the top there, they're between 10 to the 5 to 10 to the 5th or 10 to the 10th. So these are absolutely not chance results. You can do the same thing for a 3-year experiment we did where we had this same experiment online. And on the top, you then again see that there's no difference in the mean, but there's a big difference in the variance. And again, you look at the bottom graph and the odds against chance, you see now we're dealing with like odds of 10 to the 300. And around wave number 40 to 45 or so, the odds are so big they cannot even be calculated. So there's absolutely, there's something interesting going on here. And the reason I'm showing this is because this is something that I thought to do. I hadn't thought to do it before, but I went back to look at what Joe McMoneagle was saying about the future technology and about these bursts idea, looked at the data, and sure enough, you find a massive difference when people are attending at the system and people are not. In fact, if there's no one there. So in those 2 conditions, you could tell with very high certainty whether somebody was actually doing the experiment or not. So that could be the basis of a technology. So the first conclusion then is that we can tell from these experiments and many others that I've done like it, and now there's a replication from a colleague at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, that mind manipulates reality. We all know that mind perceives through space and time, through precognition, remote viewing. And magic then is a pre-scientific name for these phenomena. These are the same phenomena that people have known all the way back to shamanism. We're beginning to get a handle on it in a different way through the use of science. So that's basically what I've been doing in the lab. The second conclusion is, how can we efficiently use noetic principles, meaning intuitive principles, to bootstrap ourselves into a science which is more comprehensive and will get a better gain on what to do with these ideas. What can we learn then from magical principles? The reason I'm writing about magic is because if you have a tradition of 50,000 years of people practicing this, as compared to science, which is only about 300 years old, 300 or 400 years old, maybe those 50,000 years, the things that have persisted over that time, can tell us something that science has yet to address. And also, then how far can you push this kind of radical idea, but also maintain scientific credibility? This is something that we struggle with. We have in parapsychology from the very beginning. If you want to study these kinds of unusual phenomena, the way to do it to be scientifically credible means you can only use methods which are acceptable now. It becomes very difficult to use methods which are not yet seen as being scientific, but I think that's where we're going to need to go. We need to push our epistemology. So we're dealing with normal distributions in science, but we're trying to understand paranormal distributions. So maybe a different thing altogether. So this book will be out April 10th, which I go into all of this in great gory detail. People are responding to it, I guess, because it's already the #1 release on Amazon for this category. I told them, could you please not put it in the occult? And please not put it in the parapsychology, and they don't listen to me. So they did, though, put it within the category of philosophy. It's in that, but it's also in a number of these other metaphysical areas. But okay. So these are a couple of the quotes that I've gotten. This is a physicist at Chapman University, which is in Southern California. Jim Fallon's professor of psychiatry and human behavior. Paul Werbos, former program director at the National Science Foundation. Before he retired, I knew that Paul was very interested in these kinds of phenomena and asked him, do you think we can get funding from the National Science Foundation? And the answer was no, you can't. It's impossible. So he had to wait until he retired before he essentially came out of the closet and said, yeah, this stuff is real. It should be studied. Jessica Utz, you may know, as a statistician at UC Irvine and president of the American Statistical Association. Brian Josephson, Nobel laureate in physics. And starting next Tuesday or Wednesday, if you haven't yet read my book on supernormal, which is about the yogic tradition and the abilities that arise as a result of yogic practice, you can get the ebook for only $1.99 for a limited time. And I'll end with Elvis and the Hunka Hunka Burning Bush. This may only be funny for people who know about the Elvis songs, Hunka Hunka Burning Love, but I figured it would fit in here too. So I'm going to stop sharing there, and then we can just chat.
Okay, Dean, thank you so much. Very interesting. I'd like to add one thing about the meditators. You had shared, and I wrote about it in our online magazine, studies just like this, but there you specifically compared meditators to non-meditators.
Right.
And it was kind of amazing how the meditators, and there you're using Z-scores, the meditators went down to like Z's of 5, where the non-meditators still, some of them were able to have an influence down to 1 and 2, but the meditators did much better.
Right.
So I wanted to share that because, you know, we've had a lot of people on here, Stephen Schwartz, who's, you know, done a lot of work in that area too. I basically encourage all people interested in remote viewing and other side things really to get into meditation. Yeah, and you would obviously agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, besides what you see in improved performance in these kinds of tasks, from the magical tradition, all of magic is considered to take place in a state called gnosis. Well, like Gnosticism, but gnosis is this in the yogic tradition is called samadhi, and samadhi in a Western tradition would simply be called a very, very deep form of meditation. So these ideas have been around forever. They're called different things, but the notion is that there's some substrate of reality which is essentially mental, in a way. It's mind-like, and so in order to make things happen from that domain, your surface level awareness needs to be able to contact that. It's always in contact with it, but usually we think of it as in terms of our subconscious. So you want to make the subconscious conscious, and meditation is the safest way and the time-honored way to do that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, why don't you guys turn on your mics or put some questions in the chat box and let's interact with Dean. How we doing? Sometimes they get very quiet, Dean. I don't know why. They're shy.
I put them to sleep.
No, you
Yeah,
did.
I didn't realize that. Many of my cartoons are sort of a Merocentric, so I'm not sure how they would translate very well into other languages and cultures.
Okay, well then let me continue while they are thinking, or I know they absorb all this. That you just see the number of good comments that we get about these things. So um, the idea of becoming into this other states that you talk about, let's just stay on that for a moment. There is still, I believe, but this is a question to you, controversy about whether alpha, delta, all the different frequencies which people measure. Has it ever become clear? Is there one range that's better um, for being successful with your psi work?
Well, we know a little bit about the neuroscience. The thing is that the measures, especially frequency measures, whole brain frequency measures like alpha and theta and so on, they're extremely crude. We talk about them because that's where the flashlight's looking, and they're not that difficult to measure, but they're very, very crude measures. Uh, Now there's a little more interest because we have higher density EEG to look at regions of the brain. There are different frequencies at different regions. There's all kinds of coherence and resonances that happen between portions of the brain. Most of that has not yet been applied in any systematic way to looking what's happening when people are doing psychic stuff. Some of the things that we see in meditation, which are consistent with what we see in mediums, for example, is frontal midline theta is reduced. So roughly in this region of the brain, theta waves go down. It's like the opposite of what used to be thought, that you want to increase theta. In this case, it's a complete desynchronization of theta so that the amplitude goes down. You see that in long-term meditators. We saw it in a study we did with mediums as well. The mediums were doing whatever mediums do. Frontline theta went down a lot. The other thing is that typically for right-handed people, the right back temporal lobe is associated with increased performance as well. We don't know exactly why, but that's something that you see again and again. So we now have in the lab a 64-channel and 228-channel EEGs, which will give us the level of density that's necessary in order to do source localization. So you'll be able to tell where something is happening in the brain, because by the time it reaches the scalp, it's gone through many layers of brain structure. And so if you're picking up theta over here, it might be due to what's happening under there, might not. Might be much deeper, might be somewhere else. So we now have the capability of figuring out in much more detail than we were before on where in the brain something is happening. And given that we know a little bit now about neuroanatomy, we go to our friends who are specialists in that and say, well, what's going on when this 2 inches down there when somebody's doing something? What does that mean? And people I know can immediately spin a narrative about that. So I just said as an example, I said when we would do this study with mediums, I would say, well, when you feel like you're in contact with a deceased person or a guide, where spatially do you feel that they are? And they all said up there. It's like it's up towards the right. Even a left-handed person said it's up there. Well, and so, well, where, like, really up there? Or is it, does it come into your head like over here? Yeah, sort of over there. So I asked my friend who's a neuroanatomist, what's over there in the brain? Well, it's the area of the brain that is, it's a nexus between two areas of the brain. And then that one particular spot is, if you have brain damage, you don't have a sense of another person. So that's the region of the brain that gives you a sense of the existence of another person. So the mediums are sensing some disembodied thing in that spot, which we thought was interesting. We haven't taken it any further yet because we don't know what to do with that other than, well, that's an interesting effect. So that's the kind of thing that we hope to be able to learn because of these higher density systems that we have now.
Well, and you see one other, and this in some ways has been a holy grail that in the remote viewing community we're looking for, which of course is ARV as well, is when the remote viewer is on. He generates this long transcript, but when he is on, when he's got good information, which after the fact, is there some signature that you can identify? Because then you'd be able to interpret the transcripts much better. So
Right.
hopefully you're going to be able to do some work on that as well. And then let me add, maybe I didn't pick this up exactly right, but in your talk, when you were talking about variance, and I think I'd like to hear more about that variance in that signal. It seemed like it was an indicator, that a clear indicator that there was something going on. Can you measure that in real time? Is that
Well,
variance? Of course, there's a lot of samples, but I don't know on what time frame you're doing that.
yeah. So that the difference that we found was based on an enormous amount of data.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know yet whether we can detect that in real time. When we were asking Joe, what do you see that is then eventually used as a way of detecting if somebody's doing something, the implication was it is a real-time effect.
Mm-hmm.
But we haven't done an experiment yet. I just recently went back to this database to see if the effect showed up, and it did on composite, but I don't know. I don't know what happens on the basis of individual trials. But now it becomes a hypothesis that we can test. I see that Evelyn is saying the audio is breaking. That may be because my wife is just taking a shower, and so I can hear the shower behind me, and it's probably getting into my audio a little bit. So that'll stop in a few minutes.
Okay. Any other questions, comments?
I have one. This is Donna.
Go ahead, Donna.
How are you guys today?
Good.
So in your research, have you done any of that kind of research towards the shamanic traditions that use plant-based hallucinogens like ayahuasca or mushrooms, things like that?
I haven't. We have talked about this for many years at IONS, where I work. We felt that because it's a Schedule I drug in the United States, you need all kinds of federal approval in order to do it legally. We're not going to do it illegally. It's the climate is beginning to change now. You still need federal approval to do it, but you don't need federal approval for things like ketamine. So we're actually working with a colleague who's a neurobiologist who has some experience using ketamine, and with psychiatrists in San Francisco, which is nearby where we are, who are using ketamine as part of their therapeutic practice. Ketamine in the right dose will produce hallucinogenic effects very similar to psilocybin. And we are in negotiations now on how to create a psi experiment that for these patients, many of whom have a lot of experience with ketamine states now, so that we can start doing experiments on it legally. We also have friends who are doing approved studies with psilocybin and other substances, but in those cases, we'd have to add on our tests to an existing protocol. And so far, we haven't gotten to that point because the topic is still considered controversial, and it may or may not be approved. But because ketamine is legal, that's the direction we're going to take.
So do you think that because in our culture it is, excuse me, considered kind of taboo versus places where they've done it for generations and, never thought a thing of it, could that actually change the outcome of how your brain would work in those situations just by being inhibited, I guess, from us in Western culture versus a shaman or their ancestors that have done it, pretty much through all time.
Right. So culture probably does influence what happens in experiments. I have colleagues in Brazil where it's a very different kind of culture and they're far more open to this sort of thing. And generally, so far in the experiments that I've been hearing that they're doing, they're getting better results than we do, which is, I suspect, because of the cultural support. When it comes to the psychedelics, at least within the subculture of people who use a lot of psychedelics, they have their own culture. They like
Right.
because we're in the U.S. and it's illegal, they don't care. They're doing it, and in some cases, doing it under the protection of a religious order. So Native Americans can use peyote and a few other things, and that is acceptable as part of their church practice. So since I live in the Northern California area, our culture is very different than it might be in the middle of America. And there's much more support for these kinds of ideas. And so maybe as America as a whole, the culture wouldn't support it, but at least where we are, it's not a big deal.
Got it.
That's a very interesting kind of imagery, in the sense that at this level of pure information, collective consciousness, that the culture, how local, how expanded, does it get to the world, has an impact on the individual, not being conscious of that, yet creating noise potentially or encouraging it. Very hard to evaluate, but I would think that would be a factor.
Well, I assume that it's a factor. And as a result, I very rarely will talk about an experiment that is underway, because I don't want the noise of additional minds thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
I have been very protective of the exact location of the laboratory, because I want a clean test tube, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
We generally, we've recently moved back to our old location. We were away for a couple of years. So in the old days, in the laboratory, whenever we would finish an experiment, we would do a space clearing exercise, sometimes even between individual subjects. So my assistant at the time was very adept at doing those kinds of rituals, and it was somewhat superstitious, except that she could feel the difference. She could feel that some people were different somehow, so she had to clean out the energy, and I don't feel it, but she did. So just as a matter of practice, then we would try to make the space as clean as possible in every dimension, every way that we could think of whenever we would do an experiment for that reason.
That's beautiful. In fact, when we're starting our RV session, some people might very well want to do that. Clear out the space they're in, block any negative stuff.
Yeah, and it simply becomes part of a practice.
Yeah.
It doesn't even matter if it's superstitious, because any kind of ritual, some of it includes what are you doing to prepare yourself to be open to the possibility of something. That's what the ritual is for. So I think some of it is that. Some of it might also be that there are spare energies floating around. You just don't want them.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, at one time, even though I don't tend to be very sensitive to those kinds of energies, we had a number of people come into the lab and they're looking at it. And we were saying, well, what do you think of this space? Because the space usually feels very nice inside the shielded room. And they said, oh, this feels really nice, except something is in that corner. Many people were saying that. There's something not right about that corner. So I had my assistant come in. She said, oh, yeah, that part needs to be cleaned. So she cleaned it, doing whatever she does. And then the next people were coming in. They said, oh, this is perfectly nice. And they never mentioned that corner again. So something.
Right. Wonderful. Okay, I do see a question here. Has any research been done between brain and heart coherence?
The people doing that are primarily the Heart Math Institute. Their thing is all about the heart and coherence. And so, yeah, they're the people to go to if you want to learn about brain and heart coherence. We have not looked at that in any great detail.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other?
Yes, I have one. I have a question. Dean, I'm Arthur. My question is, I'm a bit unclear on the double slit experiment. What's the trigger for the change from the two different sets? In other words, you have two columns on one, and then you have the center one that rises, peaks in the middle. What is it that your eyes are closed when that is when the change comes, or what is the trigger there?
It's your attention. It's all about attention. So imagine that remote viewing is really, really, really good and can gain very specific information about things. So you direct your attention and you attempt to perceive what is happening inside a sealed optical system. So you're not seeing it with your eyes, you're seeing it with your mind's eye. So if you're able to do that and gain information about where the photons were going inside such an optical system, then you would change the interference pattern because the photons would behave differently. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm still unclear on that. It's what you're describing is something that is real with a light shining through a double slit. Yep. What makes the change to make it go to the peak in the center where there's no light, for example?
Yeah, the true answer is nobody knows. The fact is that empirically, if you get information of the type that I was saying, you get information about where the photons are going, like which are the two slits that the photon goes through, the pattern will change. So that's not controversial at all. That's physics 101. So this is a problem. It's known as the quantum measurement problem in physics. We don't know why the photon is sensitive to being observed, but I'm using it as a way of measuring, does the mind actually interact with the photons, even by not looking at it, but only looking at it with your mind? And the answer seems to be yes, it does. So it's just a convenient system that is well known in physics, even though the reason why the pattern changes is not known.
It's all about consciousness in some way we don't understand, Arthur. But
right.
Let me follow that up a little bit. Did they actually try to guess? Did they try to influence it? Did some people maybe try to block one hole versus the other? Did they tell you anything about their strategy?
All of the above.
Oh,
so
okay.
We typically will explain that the goal is to get information from the system. Some people with a good imagination can imagine that they can see the photons, and all we need to know is, can they see it? We don't need to know what it is, to just look at it somehow. Well, some people find that very difficult to do. So for them, they say, well, okay, just try to shove all the photons and go through the one slit rather than the other. Push it, psychokinetically push it. Others find that difficult. So we say, okay, imagine you could put your thumb over one of the slits, put a barrier there, so it forces them to go through one slit. So there are many strategies that people use, and we've asked them, and sometimes they use many different strategies in a single session. Sometimes they use just one. In addition, in most of these experiments, we also provide real-time feedback about how much interference the camera is seeing. And we turn that it's a single value that goes up and down depending on how much interference there is. If it goes up, we make a pitch sound go up, an audio sound. The pitch will go up. If it goes down, the pitch sound will go down. So they could do the experiment with their eyes closed and just listen to how much interference is going on, with the task being make this pitch sound go up or make the pitch sound go down. Doesn't matter how you're going to do it, just will that to happen, and that will give the same outcome.
That's a biofeedback.
Yeah, it's like a biofeedback thing. And some people find that the easiest way to do it, because then they don't have to think about the physics or what's happening to the photon or anything else. They just listen to a tone and try to make the tone different.
Okay. Okay. Then nobody else. I then want to ask more about the variance. Variance is interesting. The mean, when you showed that first curve, the mean were right on top of each other, which is, I think when you went into this, your expectation was that you'd be able to affect the mean.
Well, you do affect the mean, but when you collapse all of the data across all sessions and all people, and then you're looking for the difference, you do see a mean difference, but it is so small that the circles, the black and white circles, overlap each other.
Right.
You need to do the statistical test where you're looking at it basically in extreme close-up, and that's where you see the difference that we've seen in previous experiments. And so, but the variance difference you can see with your naked eye, which is, it means it's big.
Okay. Define for us. Hey, I sort of understand variance in statistics, but I don't understand it in this context. So I think everybody would benefit. Tell us more about how you measure the variance.
Okay, so every time the camera is taking a picture of the interference pattern, okay, then we take a Fourier transform of that. So you end up with the picture, the graph that has kind of a peak on the left and a peak on the right. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're doing. And we're getting that 20 times per second, right? So it's almost real time, 20 times per second. And over the course of a half an hour, you get about 20,000 of those. So about half of those will be in a condition where you're attending toward the system, and half you're relaxing. And that's then the contrasts that we're interested in the experiment. So when the statistical test that we're interested in is given these 20,000 interference, or the 20,000 curves that are Fourier transforms, what's happening in a portion that we're interested in within that spectrum, mainly this part of the spectrum that's showing the amount of interference, which is around wave number 45, plus or minus a little bit. So we look at the difference then. What's happening when they're tending toward versus tending away? That's one way to do this. But the image that I was showing here was completely independent of what the actual assigned condition was. It was all 20,000 frames per session times 250 sessions. And then the comparison then is what's happening in the experimental condition as compared to the sham condition. So it's people present doing something. And remember, what they're trying to do is modulate the interference pattern. That's the task. So there should be more variance in terms of the patterns that we're getting there as compared to the sham where there's nobody doing anything. So the variance we're talking about then is simply the amount of movement there is in the experimental condition without regard to what the person's trying to do, simply more movement in that interference pattern as compared to the sham. That's where we see this big variance effect.
Wow, okay.
And so it's interesting because it's kind of what you would expect that should happen if you have one condition where people are interacting and not interacting and interacting and not interacting. The signal should be more noisy because you're pushing it around. And a condition which is exactly the same in every other respect other than there's nobody trying to push it around, it should be a lot quieter. So the comparison between the two would show experimental should be a lot more noisy than the other one. And that's what this analysis shows. And as I said, I didn't even think about looking at it in those terms until I went back to this 20-year-old stuff that Joe McMoneagle did and said, holy crap, it looks like that's what he was saying. And now we have data where we can actually test it. And sure enough, it showed up in 2 databases to a very significant degree.
Going to be very interesting to see if you can see differences on shorter time scales, like in real time.
Yes. So that's the many next steps that could be taken. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions, comments?
What is Evelyn saying? It took a lot of energy.
Oh no, that had to do with Evelyn, and she asked a question above. Where was hers? Where she did in the peer lab, she was a subject. You see that? She changed the pixels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it took a lot of energy. Right. So it has to do with the mind wandering problem. It's very difficult to maintain attention for long periods of time. So generally in art experiments, when we ask somebody to attend, it's only for 30 seconds. The meditators don't like that sometimes because they as in a meditative practice, you might spend 20 minutes to get into a deep state. But we can't do an experiment where you have 20 minutes compared to the next 20 minutes, because it'll make an experiment a minimum of 40 minutes, and that's not enough. We need lots of comparisons between conditions. So we go to 30 seconds so that we don't absolutely need to have meditators participate. And also most people, including meditators, can eventually put their mind on something for 30 seconds and keep it pretty stable and then relax.
Though it would be interesting to see what the effect would be if you let the meditator do it for 20 minutes.
Well, we need something to compare it to. That's the problem, right? So what's the comparison? Is it the next 20 minutes where they withdraw their attention? Well, then we only have one comparison.
Well, so, the light bulb for 20 minutes.
Yes, that could be a way of doing it. Except then you still end up with basically one data point.
Well, that's right.
So that's why we're sort of stuck with the protocols that we have. They're not ideal, and that one of the reasons why we tend to get very small magnitude effects in these experiments, even though statistically they may be unequivocal, magnitude is really small because the nature of the task is artificial.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. Just anything which is forcing, and you're going to get scientists on the margin who are going to be able to say maybe there's something to this consciousness effect, and I know that's what you want to do. Okay, let's see. Would you want to speak on the Joe Rogan podcast?
I don't know. I haven't listened to that podcast, so I don't know what that's like.
Yeah. And I just wonder if there's any correlation of your and their, and the peer results. The peer results.
Our results so far, in terms of the magnitude of the effect, is probably similar to what the peer lab is reporting, not just in that experiment, but in their use of random number generators in general. That's in terms of the actual magnitude of the deviation that we see as a result of the mind attending towards something. In terms of the overall results that we get, though, I think it's bigger than I've seen either at pair or my own studies involving random number generators. It's more of a robust effect. The magnitude of the change is very small. It's a very small fraction of 1% in terms of what's happening when your mind is doing something. But we seem to be able to see the effect more robustly. It's easier to get the effect. So in a pair lab, they did an experiment with random generators for 12 years and then ended up with a certain statistical result. The longest experiment that I've tried with the double slit took 1 year, and most of them took maybe a month. And so just in terms of the amount of time and effort spent, our studies seem to be getting better results quicker.
And you say, is that because of the people you chose? But actually, I have a deeper question, and let me see if I can formulate this right. Well, it gets down to how good can we get? Think about it in terms of remote viewing. Is your sense that if you were to really work out ways to get rid of noise, and we know only one piece of the noise has to do with, the culture that you're in, probably, at least in my opinion, but that's why I'm asking you for your opinion, I think most of the noise is internal to the person's own inner psychology. We live in a society, as you pointed out, where don't you don't see this all that often, and so it's hard to believe it as much as you think you believe it at the real deep level. Now, if you could change that at the deep level, do you think that's what's stopping us, and how good do you think you could get at this?
That is certainly a factor. So other factors are fatigue. It takes energy to focus, so fatigue will get you after a while. Another is belief. It's how open you are to the phenomena, as you were suggesting. Another is how the environment is. The geomagnetic field is wrong. Doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be able to perform very well. And a very important factor is talent. You can't change talent. You either have it or you don't. But to give an example, in this large-scale experiment we did with the double-slit system, since we had so many people involved and they did so many sessions, I was able to take the results of each person over their first 5. Remember, they did 10 sessions each. So I separated them into the first 5 sessions and then sorted them according to how well they did, took the top 10 performers and predicted that they maybe had some talent because they ended up as the highest performers. If they did have talent, then their next 5 sessions should also be significant. And it was. Whereas the lowest performers got flat chance for the next 5. So that suggested talent. And then we also looked at things like fatigue. We looked at other factors that are all psychological, and they all make a difference. So people can probably, like almost anybody, can learn through practice to be better, especially if they use tips and tricks to make it better. Everyone will eventually plateau at some level of performance. People who have natural talent will plateau at a much higher level and probably get there faster as well, but they also need to practice in order to maintain that plateau.
Okay, well, that I see that as being controversial, because then how good can you get? Now, you didn't say how high that plateau was, but is it conceptually possible that remote viewers can get to be pretty close to 100%, for example? And if they keep working it, how do you define a plateau? You define a plateau because somebody has sort of stopped working at getting better, and that's almost self-defined. That's as good as I can get.
No, well, yeah, it is as good as you can get. And it's not due to lack of motivation or practice. It is the potential that you can do. So I think of people like Joe McMoneagle and others who were on the Stargate program who spent huge amounts of time and practice and constant work at it, and they would all reach a certain level. They never got to 100%. Nobody did.
Right.
And so I think that the nature of the phenomenon itself either is self-limiting in some way. And in fact, when I was interviewed for the CBS News thing, the correspondent was saying a couple of times, well, how come it's not 100%? Why can't you just demonstrate this on demand? And I said, well, why do you think people watch the Olympics? Why do we go to a football game? People are variable. We're very variable. Even the best in the world are variable. Nothing is 100%. So can we get a lot better than what we typically see now? Probably. Yeah. If you, some of it certainly has to do with what you allow yourself to be able to do. It's like giving yourself permission that it is okay to do this. Because I've seen repeatedly in the lab, somebody will do incredibly well on some kind of a task. And then the next time they come to do the task again, and they either get completely flat chance or they go in reverse and they get a significant negative effect. And so when you debrief afterwards and say, well, what happened? You did really well the first time. And the answer is they got afraid. They became afraid of their own ability and suppressed it or reversed it so that it would kind of go away. I've seen this many, many times. I see it even in myself. If I do an experiment and I get an amazingly good result, I'm not so much afraid of the, quote, power of it, but how I'm going to report that. Because if you do too well in an experiment, even your colleagues won't believe it. So there are those kind of limitations that come into play.
Yeah, those are important. I see that as well. You mentioned geomagnetic effects. God, I haven't thought about that in a long time. You know that Spottiswoode has reversed himself on the LST effect.
Yep.
Okay, but the geomagnetic effect, it still stands.
Yep.
And do you take that into account when you do your experiments?
Well, no, but we monitor it. So in this large-scale double-slit experiment, we did look, since it took place over the course of an entire year, we're able to get a wide range of geomagnetic effects, and we predict a negative correlation, and that's what we got. Significant negative correlation.
Okay. And what do you use as your measure? You use the internet has the...
Yeah, I use the AP index from NOAA.
Okay. And what do you have as the... Is there like a line above which you don't want it to go?
I haven't looked at threshold effects.
Yeah, okay.
I'm just
so
taking
it's just
a straight correlation between.
Yeah.
Actually use the log of the AP index because it makes it a little bit more well behaved.
Right.
But over the course of the year, typically you'll get a pretty good range of geomagnetic flux.
Okay, we used to monitor that, and I remember all that work, and we stopped. And some people may want to do that. They may not want to do their remote viewing session, and maybe even, and nobody knows this, in ARV, maybe the feedback session. You know, time is so strange. You might want to watch it at both times.
No, I think it would be very interesting to keep track of the time the session is done, the time that the outcome is important. My guess is it's when the session is done and not the outcome. Because what's happening with the geomagnetic field probably is that it's shaking your nervous system around, and it just makes any kind of attention much more difficult.
On the other hand, the outcome is the time when you're sharing the truth with the earlier time frame.
That's why it's a good experiment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You can't argue both ways. Okay, other questions, comments? Okay. Dean, I just thank you so much. Again, these things are just so useful. I know to everybody, including me, I always learn something new and just sort of get some new insights. And I just thank you very much. And I'll see you hopefully I'll see you in June, maybe in person, but maybe in webinar.
Thank you,
Okay?
Dean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You take care, Dean.
All right.
Okay. Let's see. There we go.